And now that we know a little bit about guns, we can now talk about the impressions that they would make on the pieces that are going to be left at a crime scene. So let's talk about these impressions. Again, let's kind of back up and just be clear on how this works. The trigger gets pulled, and that's going to cause a firing pin to hit that primer part of the cartridge casing, whether it's a shotgun shell or whether it's a bullet casing. And that's going to cause the gunpowder to explode. So the initial primer goes off, that's going to cause the gunpowder to explode. But that firing pin, it's literally hitting that primer, and that's making an impression. It's going to be one possibility that we can study of what kind of impression. And then the cartridge, so as that, we get that bigger impression. Remember, now we have that casing that's holding the bullet. It's two pieces. And as that bullet goes off, the cartridge itself, that casing, comes back and it hits the back side of the gun. And so that recoil is going to also put towards that firing pin, and there's a breech face, we call it, that the firing pin sits in. And so that breech face can also leave a breech mark on that cartridge case. And then as that bullet goes out, it's expelled through, if it's a rifle or a handgun, that bullet is going to be going through that rifled barrel, and it's going to be twisting as it goes, and it's a pretty tight fit. So if there are any tiny little scratches on the lands, those get scratched into, in a spiral pattern, they're going to get scratched into the bullet. We're going to call those striations. And so those are going to be helping us be individual. So the rifling on the handguns and the rifles cuts impressions into the bullet, and the scratches on the rifled barrel make those striation marks impressions. But the shot is just a bunch of little pellets the shot being sent out. It might get scratches on it, but not in a way that's helpful, that we can trace back. The cartridge then is often injected out of the barrel. It depends on the specific type of gun. And that injector mechanism that's kind of kicked, remember, we had two pieces. Either the shots coming out or the bullets coming out, and then there's a piece that was holding the whole piece of ammunition together, that cartridge holding thing. There was a piece that's left over that stays in the gun. I got to get it out of the gun. And so I have to eject it out. And it's generally some kind of hammer-like thing that pushes it out. And that's going to impress that and leave some kind of mark. So we have lots of things that are hitting. Every time you hit, you're going to have an impression. And now we have some possibility of having some individual marks due to that impression of when it hits. So bullet impressions themselves, again, they're going to be impressed by the rifling of the barrel. So that inner surface of the barrel leaves its markings, and these are going to be very individualistic. One, I'm going to have the lands and the grooves, right? Depending on how many lands and grooves, I'm going to get some big scratches. Wherever the lands are, you're going to get some big scratches on it. But those are going to be more class-like. And so what we see, though, is that when you make that barrel, we end up having some individual marks on it. Generally, the manufacture of the barrel means that they're not all identical. So we have microscopic drill marks that can be left, and they're not going to be identical. They're going to be randomly irregular. So now, even though they were all made in the same assembly line of the same factory, they're not going to be identical because of the process of actually how it literally drills out a solid rod. There's a couple of ways you can drill out a solid rod, and they talk about it in the book, different kinds of things. We just know that makes it slightly irregular. And then those, it's rifled with what we call a broach cutter. So then that just makes the bore size to it. And then we have to go in and cut those rifling grooves in it. And those, again, the cutter, again, is going to be some randomly irregular process. So that leaves some individual characteristics. And then I see that we can have these, so there are two ways to cut the lands and grooves, and they're each one going to be individual. So those are going to leave these individual striation marks. Additionally, wear of the gun. You know, if you've shot the gun for 5 years, if you go hunting every year and you've used it quite a bit, you're going to get individual scratch marks as that metal on metal. It might sometimes, the prior bullets might leave a little scratch on something that's again going to make it even more individualistic. So you could see that the bullets fired from a gun in year one of owning it, and the bullets fired from a gun in year 25 of owning it, if it's been in regular use, might not be the same. It may be different over time. Not by much, but a little bit. So all of these processes, the concept is that they're leaving these individual striation marks, something that will be different from gun to gun. And that's helpful. Just again, let's talk about these lands and grooves. So I have like a straw. So, and then I want to cut grooves into it. So I use this either broach cutter or a button, and I cut these grooves in, and they're going to leave low spots. They're cutting out the grooves. So that's going to be the low spots right here. And then the parts that they leave behind are going to be the lands, and the lands are the high spots. So that the original part that didn't get cut out. So we start looking at this. So this is a bullet impressed with these rifling markings. So notice that we can see if I can't get this on a laser pointer. So we can see these little striation marks. We also see some big gouges. So the big gouges are those lands scratching big gouges in, right? So I have kind of a big gouge. And then within the big gouge, I have these tiny little striation marks. The striation marks is the parts that really going to make it more individualistic. So this is typically what they're looking at. And we see a bunch of other marks on it. You know, I mean, it's a pretty rough process shooting it out of a barrel. So we get a lot of damage to the original bullet. So this would be now, this is where we can help with a comparison microscope. If I take two bullets shot from the same gun, I'm going to get some very similar characteristics. So now I can match it up. As you can see, they're looking at the pattern of these lines, and so we're looking to see, can I get a matching pattern? It may not match identical. It should be a pretty close match. And how much it matches, again, is a statistical process. The ballistics experts are kind of matching up all the number of striations that do match and kind of how many don't match, and using this to kind of say, yes, this is a match. So that becomes a judgment call on the analyst, but they have years of practice at it. But you can see these kind of, I can make them line up. And the lighting isn't quite the same, but that's okay. But the idea is I can see that the lines pretty much go across from side to side. Over here, another one. You can see that they're sort of matching up. I can almost fit them like puzzle pieces. Up here, it's not quite matching, so it may not match completely, but I should get a pretty decent match off of these. Again, we talked about there's other things that can be impressed upon parts of the ammunition. Now this part is these firing pin, breech face, and ejector mechanisms all make marks onto that casing that's left in the gun or the shotgun. And we get these mirror marks. So here, this is the firing pin. The firing pin is more like a needle. You know, it's a very small pointed thing that's going to hit that with a lot of pressure and set off the primer. And so right here, like this area is the primer, and that's that firing pin. So the firing pin itself is going to leave an impression. Then this part here, the back side of the primer, we call this the BF, for the breech face. That part gets kind of sent back. The whole thing gets sent back, but this part here, this whole flat part, so this also outer part would be part of the breech face. This whole flat part comes back and hits the back side of the gun or the breech of the gun chamber, and that can leave, if there are scratches on the back side of the breech, we can get these breech face markings. And you'll have to see some examples to sort of see what they particularly look like, you know, so you can sort of see things that get impressed. This one, it's not so easy to see. Here I can see like another little, almost like a needle hit it and impressed in it. The ejector mechanism tends to be another sort of pointy object that kind of pushes it out. And so this is the ejector mechanism making a mark. So I have three types of impressions that can be made onto that casing that I'm going to be looking at. And one would be the firing pin impression, another is the breech face mark, and another is the ejector mechanism. When I go talking now about class characteristics, so the only way I can really make matches on those impressions is I have to have two pieces of evidence. One that came from the crime scene or the suspect or whatever, and another came from the same weapon where I fired a standard to it. If you don't have the weapon, this becomes a problem, well, right? So I don't have the weapon to make a second one, but I could look at just one individual, either casing or bullet, and look for marks on it that tell me something. But these would be class characteristics. So I have the rifling characteristics. How many lands and grooves? So how many of those big grooves got impressed upon the bullet? The proximate width of the thing and the direction of the twist. So it turns out some guns are rifled with a right twist and some guns are rifled with a left twist. I can tell that. And then the caliber or gauge. How big is the bullet? I can tell what kind of barrel it came from. So I can tell something about the gun, and I might be able to say it was from this type of gun. It won't be enough to say it was from this actual weapon. Again, part of this is now the way we're going to analyze all of these things to get these individual characteristics is looking at a comparison microscope, where I have two pieces of evidence, one being either the bullet or the casing that came from the crime scene, and another standard, ideally, or it might be one from the Niven database, where I take that other piece and I'm going to look at it side by side. So we have two bullets, the test bullet and the evidence bullet, observed and compared simultaneously. So we must have identical lands and grooves, and then on top of it, I have to have identical striations to say I have a match. We will use computer imaging, so this is often coming from that NIBIN, or I say Niven, I don't know how the professionals refer to this database, but that Niven database is going to have images of standards, images of different individual bullets that I can match up against. Now, a match of a real piece of evidence against a computer image can get me close, but it's not considered acceptable as it is. So in other words, the idea, remember there was it's grown, it started as drug fire, it then became IBIS, and now the current one is the National Integrated Ballistics and Information Network. So we have bullets and cartridge casings retrieved from crime scenes or from test fires linking a specific weapon to that specific crime. But the ultimate decision would have to be the physical piece of evidence. So in other words, somewhere behind the scenes in Niven's database, it links to where is the actual piece of evidence that made this image? Where is this piece of evidence from a crime scene? Or where is this test bullet? And you have to reach out to the people who own that piece of evidence and borrow it and literally see your evidence and the original evidence that made the image side by side to truly get what is considered something that will hold up in court, a definitive match. But at least this database gets you close and says, okay, I think I have a match. There's a possibility in the future that when manufacturers make a gun, they'll do a test fire of it before it ever gets sold, and that test fire of that bullet would be put into a database. So now I'm not just matching against stuff that's been found at crime scenes or weapons that were taken and then made test fires of, but all weapons. That's obviously controversial, but that's a possibility for future development. And again, so this is just sort of saying when you have the original piece of evidence, how do you make that image to then put it into the database? And it's sort of a process of using a microscope with a video camera that then digitizes it, and then it gets sent off to this database so that it can be used by other people. So, okay, this might be a flow chart of what would happen. So you get a bullet, firearm, arrives at lab. So you'd have to have both. You'd have to have a bullet and a possible weapon firearm. You examine it to see, does it have the same class characteristics? So does it have the same rifling number of lands and grooves? If the bullet and it doesn't, you're done. It can't be a match. You've excluded that firearm from being the firearm that could have shot that bullet. If it does match, now it's worth going on and doing more investigation. So if the bullet does match, it has the same class characteristics, now it could have been fired from that firearm. So at this point, now there's going to be a comparison microscope. You have to take that weapon, test fire a bullet. So now I have a bullet and a bullet. The bullet that I found at the crime scene, the bullet that I just fired from that test weapon that I think might be the weapon, and I can put them side by side in a comparison microscope and look at those striation marks and see if I have a match. If they don't match, that bullet was not fired from that gun. Done. Total exclusion. If I get a partial match, I'm left with it could have been, but I don't have great confidence in it. I have confidence in it, but maybe not enough. It could be contested. If I have what's considered a match, then it was fired from the firearm. Now again, this partial match and match is a decision made by the analyst. And so now that's subject to experience and bias. So that's where, and statistics.